USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast for Thursday, March 17th, 2022. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. This podcast is brought to you by DCU Digital Federal Credit Union. What will DCU mean to you? Find out today by visiting dcu.org. Membership required. There's a big tournament going on in St. Paul, Minnesota this weekend. If you haven't heard about it, it's the NCHC Frozen Faceoff. And who better to have on to talk about that tournament than somebody who probably sees that league more than just about anybody else in the country.
And joining us now on the Game of the Week podcast to preview the Frozen Faceoff in the NCHC, one of the best tournaments every year, Alex Heinert. He's from Midco Sports, but you will see him this week alongside Dave Starman on the CBS Sports broadcast of the tournament. Alex, welcome in. This is the best time of the year.
Oh, I would agree. No, thanks so much for having me, Jim and Ed. It's a pleasure. And it is that time of year that gets you excited as a sports fan. It's going to be a tremendous weekend across college hockey, and I really can't wait for it.
So let's just jump right into it. You know, two great semifinals on Friday night out at Xcel Energy Center. I know this is, a great venue. Great to be back in a big venue with the big tournament, with fans and all of that good stuff that makes stuff feel a little bit more normal. But what do you expect, just in these first two games in terms of each of the four teams? You had three of the four favorites advance. I would say that Minnesota Duluth was not a huge underdog advancing past St. Cloud State. But what do you think of these four teams?
Well, I think first, like you said, you were always going to have one of the top 10 teams in the country not make this field when you've got Minnesota Duluth playing St. Cloud State in a quarterfinal. And obviously those two have had so many battles in the second half of the season that it wasn't a huge shock that Duluth was able to go down and pick up a couple of wins at the Herb Brooks National Hockey Center. St. Cloud State was a little banged up too. They didn't have their goaltender. They didn't have their captain for that series because of illness. But the fact that you've got in this first semifinal, Minnesota Duluth against Denver, it's a national championship rematch from a handful of seasons ago, but two very different style teams. And then in your second semi where you've got North Dakota and Western, two teams that are built very much the same. So it kind of gives you a really unique picture of what different college hockey programs can look like, from high-powered offenses to teams that want to grind you down and win 2-1. It's special that we'll have four of the top 8 teams in the country battling on one day, and then two winners moving on to Saturday's championship game. It's going to be, again, a tremendous weekend. I just can't wait for it at the Xcel. First time back there for a couple seasons as well. So the anticipation for this has been going for a while.
I think of that North Dakota Western Michigan game. That is one that, to me, feels a little off. Like you've had so many great rivalries that North Dakota have faced in the postseason. Western really hasn't been one of them. And this is a really upstart team that has played very well this year. I'm not sure that everybody expected Western to be right in the mix here to the end, but Pat Ferschweiler and what he's done there in his first year as head coach has made this team a little bit more exciting to watch. What do you do? How do you handicap those two teams when you look at North Dakota, and they tend to fly a little bit more? Western loves to shut down teams. How do these two teams match?
Yeah, I mean, we talked to Pat Ferschweiler earlier this week, and he mentioned, and he said this too. We did a North Dakota Western game back at the end of February in Grand Forks on CBS Sports Network, and at the time as well, Pat said we really mirror each other. They're big physical teams. Western's a little bit older than North Dakota. They brought back a number of fifth-year seniors, but they both like to get up and down the ice. They both like to take time and space away. They both play a physical game. Honestly, too, they both sort of have standout forwards in Ethan Frank and Reese Gaber, who were first team all conference. They both have standout defensemen in Jake Sanderson and Ronnie Addard, and they both have really solid goaltending. And so to your point about the Broncos, they finished 6th last year in the conference, and they had kind of a tough season. But that wasn't really the Western team that we expected. They lost their starting goaltender on the first game of the year and never really recovered from that until the end of the season. And we got to see a little bit of what that Broncos team was all about down the stretch last year. So even though they were picked to finish towards the bottom of the NCHC, most of that was just because how are you going to put them ahead of some of the teams that returned so much talent that finished ahead of them a season ago? But I think those are the no new. they were going to be better than what the record was last year. And they've proven that out this season. It does set up for a really unique challenge, though, when you've got two teams that want to do the same things, that have a lot of firepower on both ends. They split the season series evenly. Western won both games in Kalamazoo. North Dakota won both games in Grand Forks just a couple of weeks ago. It is a finely poised 2-3 matchup in the semifinals between two teams that expect to go a long way in the national tournament.
The other game, Denver and Minnesota Duluth, as you mentioned, they've played some huge games against one another in the past, a national title game not too long ago. But these are two different teams in many facets from what they were maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago. How do you handicap these two teams? Because it does feel like, I look at Duluth as a heavy team. I look at Denver as a fast, talented team. Which one wins out?
That's the question, right? We're going to find out on Friday. It was a season split again. Same thing. They both split in Denver and in Duluth this season. All of the games were not particularly close in terms of the score, but they were competitive, tight games regardless. And, Denver's the top scoring team in the country, and they've really rebounded from a disappointing season last year. And again, there were a number of factors why they struggled a bit from what we're used to seeing out of the Pioneers a season ago. But they're so loaded offensively, and their blue line is phenomenal. I mean, they're young back there, but they've got a lot of guys that can move the puck. And they're one of the best puck possession teams in the country for a reason. And they're going to score 3, 4, 5 goals every game. Minnesota Duluth, meanwhile, not a high-powered offense by any stretch, but they have been through this before. They brought back a number of guys that know only going to the Frozen Four. That's all they've known in their collegiate careers. Guys like Kobe Roth and Kobe Bender and Louis Rail and Matt Anderson at the back. And Ryan Fanti is an all-conference goaltender this year, really stepping up in his second season as the full-time starter. Minnesota Duluth just has a habit of finding a way to win. It's a broken record, but they are a team that is built for the postseason because they're used to winning games 2-1 or 3-2. We'll see if Denver's been able to take this style of play over the years, and it's translated beautifully to the postseason. And obviously, we've seen them win a national championship. We've seen them make the Frozen Four a couple of times in the last 5 years. Now they go up against this Bulldog team. It is that classic battle of the irresistible force against the immovable object. And we're going to find out who wins out on Friday night.
Alex, 3 of the finalists, I'm going to edit that. It's one of those days. The 3 finalists for the Herb Brooks Coach of the Year award in the NCHC are in this Final Four. David Carl at Denver, Brad Berry at North Dakota, and we talked about Pat Ferschweiler. And you can make a great case for each of them. David Carl turning things around from a tough season last year. Brad Berry with injuries and kind of a depleted lineup with guys turning pro. And first-year head coach turning things around at his alma mater. Does anybody stand out in this, or are you going to be as surprised as everyone else on Thursday when it's announced?
Well, it's 3 phenomenal candidates, and 3 great stories, and all a little bit different, right? Anytime you see someone take a team that was 6th in the league a season ago in his first season in charge and move them up 3 spots in the NCHC, that's a really impressive coaching job. Same thing, and again, we're talking about Pat Ferschweiler in that sense. Same thing in Denver with David Carl. Again, they finished in the bottom half of the league last year. They're top 3 in the country this season and want to share the Penrose Cup with a really young team, one of the youngest teams in the NCAA. And then Brad Berry, takes a team that had been such a juggernaut and essentially the exact same team 2 years in a row with 1 or 2 different pieces in there. And you basically have to completely change your roster. You flip it in half. 14 guys new, 13 guys gone, 8 of which to the NHL. And for Brad and that staff to sort of plug and play and just keep rolling and win another Penrose, again, sharing the championship with Denver, it's really impressive given all they've gone through. I think that Brad is the odds-on favorite just because what that team had to go through this year, how much adversity they went through, how this was a completely different group that we saw have success in recent years. I think it would be a bit of a surprise if he doesn't win it again. It'd be his 3rd straight season winning the award, but that doesn't take anything away from what David Carl and Pat Ferschweiler have done with their respective programs. It's been really a number of impressive coaching jobs in the league this season.
This is also the Frozen Faceoff swan song for NCHC Commissioner Josh Fenton, who has been so instrumental, not only with the NCHC almost from its inception, but also setting the standard for college hockey and how a conference should be run. Plus, you got to give him and the staff credit for the ingenuity of the bubble in Omaha, which I know you got to spend time in during the COVID season last year. I'm sure you can't encapsulate it into just a few words, but if you could try, Josh Fenton and what he's meant to this league.
Oh, he's meant everything to this league, Ed. Like, he's essentially been the only commissioner the league has ever known. I know he didn't quite start on day one, but since the puck dropped, he's been the guy that's been running the show. And you mentioned a lot of the accomplishments that he and his staff, Michael Weissman and Verna Toller and the rest of that group have been able to pull off. It's been really impressive to see him pull this conference together, again, with schools that don't necessarily have a lot of history. You referenced Western against North Dakota. They didn't play each other at all until they became conference members. And for him to take teams from Colorado and teams from Ohio and Michigan and kind of make it all work with the group in between, they've really become a conference. Josh is a great human being that wants what's best for his member institutions, but also for college hockey in general. And you can see that the way that he approaches issues, the way that he takes a look at, not just NCHC problems, but things that pop up in the greater college game. He's been a treat to work with. I'm happy that I get to keep working with him. I do a lot of summer league coverage as well for Midco Sports. And so we get to keep Josh in our lives moving forward. But he will be sorely missed within college hockey and within the NCHC for sure.
You say that well. Josh has become one of the best friends of college hockey. And I think that is a general term that doesn't matter what league you're with. Hey, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I think that you have to make predictions in this world. And at least tell me, who do you think are the two teams that will be facing off on Saturday for the NCHC championship? I won't ask you to crown a champion, but I'm just going to ask you to at least tell me who you think can win on Friday.
Well, the easy answer is anybody, Jim. And I think because I'm calling the games, I'm going to refrain from making my picks. I really think both of these games are complete toss-ups. I really do. I mean, just again, when you look at what they did over the season, how teams are playing coming into this weekend, all four of these teams swept good teams in the quarterfinals. It's anybody's game. And again, I think that some of that intrigue will make this weekend that much more fun. We could have any combination of teams on Saturday's championship game, and I wouldn't be all that surprised. It really is a true, legitimate toss-up going into this weekend.
Well, I'll tell you, I am ready for a Minnesota Duluth, North Dakota rematch and a 7-8 overtime. So that's how my little mind works.
You're the only one, Jim. I don't know.
Hey, Alex Heinert, I think this is one of the best weekends in college hockey, and I think you're in one of the best locations, the NCHC Frozen Faceoff. So do a great job with our friend Dave Starman this week on CBS Sports, and thanks so much for taking the time. We always appreciate getting to catch up with you.
No, of course. It's my pleasure. And you are right. I'm one of the lucky ones that gets to be there this weekend. It's going to be a blast. So, and thanks, fellas. Enjoy.
That's Midco and CBS Sports' Alex Heinert. More of the Game of the Week podcast in a moment.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Know how people say life happens? Well, for me, life was happening, and I needed a new truck. I didn't have time to shop around for a good loan, so I got one from the dealer, higher interest and all. Month after month, those payments were squeezing me. So I went to DCU. They refinanced my loan and helped lower my rate, which lowered my payments. These days, I have more money in my pocket for whatever life throws at me. What will DCU mean to you? Insured by NCUA. Membership required. Visit DCU.org.
Welcome back to the Game of the Week podcast. Jim, why don't we start out with the NCHC? We just talked about it in depth with Alex Heinert. I've got to agree with him that it's probably a toss-up on this one, but boy, if I had to pick underdogs in this one, that might be the case too. But they're two great matchups. Western Michigan versus North Dakota. They both swept each other at home. And Minnesota Duluth versus Denver. Two very different teams as opposed to similar teams with the other two. What's your take on this terrific tournament this weekend?
Well, I think the number one thing that goes through my mind is all four teams, both matchups, all four teams were really efficient last weekend, swept their series, played very good hockey. Some required some tougher games. Some were pretty easy. But I look at the fact that you got through all four of these teams got through and, really played good hockey, despite the fact that some teams were limping in, and I think that North Dakota, that was a team that I was really concerned with a month ago, not concerned about anymore. Denver, boy, they played really well down the stretch. I look at, Minnesota Duluth right now. I've had some really big concerns about them, and Western at times has been the best team out there, and then they've not looked great at times, but all four of these teams are playing well. And I think that's one of the more difficult things to do at this time of year. I don't know how to handicap this one. I was kind of joking when I said that I saw a Minnesota Duluth and North Dakota final. Obviously, it would be wonderful to rematch that game from the regionals last year that seemed to go until about 17 hours past the time it started. What did it end up being? 5 overtimes by the end of it. It was ridiculously long. Great game. But, I don't think you don't get those type of games in conference tournaments. Those are much more geared toward either first round conference tournaments or they're geared toward the NCAA regionals. You don't see these inside the Final Fours of the different leagues for whatever reason. But I look at, all four of these teams viable. All four of them can win this championship. All four of them are built for this championship. So I think there's some good hockey to be played out in St. Paul.
There's going to be some great hockey on the other side of the Mississippi in Minneapolis as number 4 Michigan comes in to take on number 2 Minnesota. And we were talking about this on Monday, what an impact a win for Michigan would have on them for the pairwise. They get a 1.2 multiplier on this for the win, whereas Minnesota gets a 0.8. 3/4 of the scenarios for the weekend have Michigan ending up the number 1 seed, and a win here is part of that scenario.
And that's huge, right? I think that the ability to be the number 1 overall seed, the committee in the last, I'm going to say 10 years at least, has made as much as it could to make sure that the number 1 overall seed would play the lowest remaining seed. And whether that becomes the team from Atlantic Hockey, it technically could become teams from other leagues right now, depending on who wins. But if you want to be playing the team that seems to make sense the most, you want to be the number 1 overall seed. I think they've played hard and fast. If you're the number 2 seed, that maybe you get the 14 or the 13, you don't get the 15 overall. I think that this becomes pretty big in terms of what Michigan can do. I think they'd rather play an AIC or a Mercyhurst or an RIT, potentially maybe, who knows, it could be Colgate, whoever could be that lowest team remaining. You'd rather play that team. You'd rather just give yourself the better odds and then make yourselves work against a very good, but what should be a considerably different team than, say, what if Ohio State were at 15 or if Umass Lowell falls to 15. Like, if one of those teams in that slot, you want to be able to make sure that you're playing the team that gives you the best chance of winning. So this does become a big game for Michigan. If they win this game, they put themselves in a much better position to do that. And you mentioned it, Ed. This is technically a road game for Michigan. This is not a neutral site game in the tournament. It's a times 1.2 multiplier for a win. Same thing goes for the CCHA tournament. It's a times 0.8 multiplier for Minnesota State if they win. That's why you're looking at both of these teams. If they both win, there's a much better chance for Michigan to pass Minnesota State in the pairwise.
Yeah, and speaking of Minnesota State, they take on Bemidji, and Bemidji would probably end up being that number 15 seed if they were to move on. That's not an enviable opponent. We just asked Wisconsin last year. This one seems like it should be Minnesota State's game to win, but we know that Tom Serratori can do a great job getting his team ready for those single games.
He can, but I'll tell you, there's more teams rooting against Bemidji State in this country right now than any other team probably out there. Bemidji could be the one team that wrecks the postseason bids for teams like UMass Lowell, Ohio State. Certainly, if Bemidji wins, Ohio State is out of the tournament. UMass Lowell, Northeastern, even UMass Amherst, all three of those teams from Hockey East are potentially caught in the crosshairs, and they all involve Bemidji State winning their first game, their only game. That game doesn't happen till Saturday, so it's so strange. If you're kind of in that pairwise bubble, you'd rather have a lot of things decided on Friday night so that you know where you stand going into Saturday. it's going to be unlikely. I think Northeastern and UMass can control their destinies, but Umass Lowell, and even if they win on Friday, there's a chance they could fall out of the tournament picture depending on things that happen on Saturday. And certainly Ohio State, they're going to watch this thing right down to the end. They might not have to watch after Friday. There's certain outcomes on Friday. Like if Quinnipiac loses their game against Colgate, then they can kind of cancel out their Saturday watching priorities. But Ohio State's going to be watching a lot of hockey this weekend.
Turning to Hockey East, you mentioned a big matchup. UMass Lowell ranked number 13 in the USCHO, DCU USCHO poll. Also, they're taking on number 11, UMass, in one of the Hockey East semifinals. UMass is in a better position, but both of these have got to approach it like a must-win game.
I think they do, and it shouldn't be hard. These are two rivals. I think that UMass, they have one natural rival. It's probably Umass Lowell. Everybody kind of sees schools like BU as a rival, but that's not a real rival for either of these schools. UMass maybe has a little bit of a rival in their I-91 partner in Connecticut. Umass Lowell probably has a rival in the team they just beat, Merrimack. But truly, these two sister schools, they've become rivals in the last 3-4 years. They played against each other for the Hockey East Championship last year. Should be a great battle. But both of them have to look at this right now as potentially being big games in terms of qualifying for the NCAA tournament.
And you can especially say that for Northeastern in the other half of the bracket. UConn has to win to get in. Number 10 in the poll, Northeastern, is number 14 in the pairwise. They're on the bubble. They really need this game.
Well, it's so weird. I mean, UConn, you know what your fate is. You either win this tournament or you're not going to go on. In Northeastern, you've won the Hockey East regular season. You're going to end up with a minimum of 25 wins, maybe 26. You've done what you think are all the right things, but there's been some tough losses for Northeastern this year that really have hurt them. Vermont late in the season kind of was a dagger for them.
Arizona State
didn't, a game that they added, just to maybe try to get Arizona State a game, try to get themselves a game. They ended up losing it. That didn't help them. They're in really good position. And again, if certain teams win this weekend, Quinnipiac, Minnesota State, those are the two that kind of stand out to me. If those two teams win their league championships, their position is much better. But they, of the three Hockey East teams, are in the worst position. All that said, they are the one team that if they win on Friday and get into the Hockey East finals on Saturday, they guarantee themselves a position in the finals. I'm sorry, they guarantee themselves an NCAA position no matter what happens in the finals on Saturday.
Let's take a look at the other leagues quickly. ECAC hockey, they're up at the venerable 1980 Olympic Arena in Lake Placid. Colgate takes on Quinnipiac, 5-1 and 4-0 wins for Quinnipiac during the season. And then the other part of that is Clarkson and Harvard, teams that got a win to get in that have had decent seasons.
Yeah, Quinnipiac should be the winner here, right? But if they're not, then it screws up a lot of people. It screws up a lot of teams. Somebody will get knocked out. Number one is Ohio State. They go out first if Quinnipiac doesn't win. Especially if they lose on Friday, then you kind of know what your future is. I think that, I look at the matchup for Quinnipiac against Colgate. They've handled them well this year, and Quinnipiac has been very stingy. It's about scoring goals. And I think we looked at the struggles of Quinnipiac as the season went on later in the season, I thought that scoring goals became their biggest issue. And if they can take care of that business and get pucks in the net, they should have no problem this entire weekend. But that's a big but. And then you look at Harvard and Clarkson. Harvard played great last weekend at times. They had to rally to get a win in game one against RPI. Lost in overtime in game two, but then handled things in game three. Clarkson, they took care of business last weekend. I look at Casey Jones and what he's done with that program. That's a good team right there. They had higher expectations this year, did not always follow through. But now it's, tournament time. I always think of them as a very difficult tournament team as well.
And in Atlantic hockey, actually some teams are going to be watching to see what happens there. If AIC ends up being the league champion, they would probably be seated above Bemidji and Colgate and maybe even Harvard, depending on how things go. The other teams, RIT, Air Force, and Mercyhurst, all would be the 16th seed overall. A new location, a new neutral location for this tournament in Utica, New York. And there is some rumbling there as Utica University has some ambitions to take the school to Division II and the hockey program to Division I. They are going to try to prove that they are worthy of that. Now, they get 3,000 people in that arena for Utica's D3 games. They're hoping some locals show up and bring some atmosphere. But, this is a tough one to pick. This is the only league where lower seeds have had a lot of success leading into the Final Four weekend.
Yeah, I think of Mercyhurst, and their ability to continue to go on and play well in that tournament. Good for them. That's a team that I thought they were kind of behind the eight ball when the season ended. So Rick Godkin, his team, when they don't allow goals, they are very successful because they score a ton. Goaltending is a big issue for them. I look at AIC, just an experienced team, RIT and Air Force, total wild cards, both of them really good teams, really well coached teams. And you get into those situations where, it comes down to just making the right adjustments in the game. I put those two teams potentially, near the top, but they play each other. So, what's going to happen in that game? Who knows? This is a crapshoot tournament for me. I would love to just say AIC should win it, but you never know. And I think that RIT probably brings the most fans to this venue and creates an atmosphere. The only team that is kind of local that can create an atmosphere. AIC not that far away, but I just don't think that they'll travel that well to create any sort of atmosphere. So I look at this as, RIT could create an almost home ice atmosphere for themselves, and that would be a big lift. But I don't know. This is one where I just think that you have 4 good teams, 4 good coaches. All 4 can win.
And all 4 teams are getting great goaltending. Air Force goaltender Alex Schilling got his first shutout in a 1-0 overtime win over RIT. Got that in his senior year. Both those goal games out at Air Force this season were 1-goal games that went to overtime. We've talked about Kyle McClellan at Mercyhurst, how he's doing. AIC has a third-team goaltender in Jake Kaharski in the league, and the rookie of the year at goal for RIT is Tommy Scarfoni, who in a 3-game series against Sacred Heart had something like a .958 save percentage and 1.2 goals against.
Great numbers, and if this becomes a tournament of goaltending, if the goaltenders win out, Mercyhurst could be the best team in the whole tournament, and they are the lowest seed remaining. So you never know.
Well, it should be a great weekend of hockey, all around college hockey. And it all culminates with a selection show on ESPN Plus on Sunday at 6:30 p.m.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.